Melissa Harrison here for our latest edition of the Religion Unplugged podcast. This week we travel to Sri Lanka, where we are joined by one of the Media Project's board members, Vishal Arora, who is taking a deep dive to find out answers about the Sri Lanka Easter Day attacks. Vishal is talking with Nishan De Mel. He is the executive director of Verité Research to get a deeper analysis of who's behind the attacks, what they may want, who or what they were targeting, and what this all means for South Asia's religious groups and stability. Let's listen in.
In Sri Lanka, we have been vigilant about the nature of politics, political violence as well as religious violence, and that has been an issue that we have been studying and researching and looking at data. And not just looking at the data, but trying to understand the socio-political dynamics behind, especially religious violence. And of course, political violence has a different kind of manifestation. With all that going on and all that we have seen and understood about the country, its social dynamics, its religious dynamics, and its political dynamics, if you had asked me on Saturday morning, what is the probability of an Islamic group attacking Christian churches in Colombo, I would have put it close to zero. I would have said there is no chance. It was completely unforeseen by most people, and even us, where we are supposed to be able to see things that are not foreseeable. And I think it took us completely by surprise. We did not anticipate it, and I think could not have anticipated it also. But of course, that claim is potentially contradicted by the intelligence-related documents that have come out afterwards. But I think that I don't read it as a simple contradiction. I read it as a complex contradiction. I don't think it was foreseeable, which for me creates a real complex puzzle about those who foresaw it. To be able to foresee an attack of this nature, which in many ways I think defies the logic of how one would have analyzed it, requires a great deal more than analytical intelligence. It requires a certain level of connection to perpetrators, which I think I find a little mystifying from our intelligence community.
And who do you think was the target of these attacks?
Who was the target? I think at a superficial level, it is clear who paid the price and what the consequences were. But I think when people ask that question, surely that's not what we're asking. Okay, we are not simply asking who died. And I think it may be more helpful to ask the question, not who was the target, but what was the target, because I think in any attack like this, the objectives, or any terrorist type attack, the objectives are disconnected from the subjects on whom the violence is targeted. So the subjects were actually instrumental, and the target is not people or persons, but something more symbolic or important. And the target here, I think, on one hand, is for sure the economy, because the selection of high-profile hotels in Colombo and the breakfast restaurants that are mostly frequented by tourists is a clear targeting of foreign individuals in a way that would hugely undermine confidence for investors, for foreigners who are involved in interacting with Sri Lanka in an economic sense. These are the business hotels of the country. Because many of these hotels also had Easter brunches. actually all of them, all three of them. I was scheduled to be at the Easter brunch at Cinnamon Grand, which was one of the hotels that was targeted. If they had waited a few more hours, I would have been able to, actually have a more first-hand view of what went on. I was fortunate that that didn't happen. So clearly, if it was a question of maximizing life lost to make a statement, then brunch time was when it could have been done. But what was targeted was the restaurant in which overnight guests usually come with bed and breakfast, would be having breakfast. And that, I think, is an indication that there is a targeting of foreign nationals, which again connects to targeting the economy. I think the second thing that is targeted, and we can come back to this, is the Sri Lankan politics itself is targeted. Because very definitely the attack has changed the political discourse in a serious way. It has brought into question the political system and undermined confidence in the politics. And the reason I say this is, it is not a single sporadic attack, right? Or some one bomber setting off a bomb in a marketplace. That kind of thing you can always say doesn't affect the whole political system. This was perhaps the most coordinated, sophisticated attack on civilian targets that we have seen in Asia, I would say. Okay, so it is an extremely interesting in terms of the sophistication, the coordination over a short period of time, over a large geography, a large number of attacks that take place. So the target, I think, has a political dimension, because the moment it happens also, there is a leak that tells you the government knew and didn't act. The combination of events certainly, I think, targets the economy and targets the politics in a way that I will come back to later as to what is the impact on the politics and the state as a consequence here. So I think this question that also comes into play in trying to understand and explain what happened is how does general communal tension that exists in Sri Lanka both fit in as a cause and what is the consequence on that tension. If I try to think through that, I think that we have a long history in Sri Lanka of communal tension and violence. It takes an ethnic form and a religious form, and over the course of post-independence history since 1948, we have seen both chronic and acute versions of both in Sri Lanka, between the acute and the chronic forms of violence that target, especially in terms of religious nature, but I don't need to recap, I think, today the history of ethnic violence that we've had. However, what's interesting in Sri Lanka is that after the end of the war, the ethnic war, that was between representatives of the Tamil people and the Sri Lankan state, that was seen as representing the Sinhala people, what you found was a very new development of tensions between the Sinhala Buddhists and the Muslims. I say very new because in the nature and level in which it re-emerged was quite new. If you go back to 1915, you have a record of tensions and violence between Buddhists and Muslims, and that has a lot written about it. But the way in which it emerged after 2010 was quite new for Sri Lanka and quite unexpected. It was really, it had some elements of similarity to what we see in Myanmar, and it was Buddhist leaders and institutions borrowing, in a sense, some of the same attitudes and approaches in positioning hostility towards the Muslims within Sri Lanka. So I think that the Muslims have become in Sri Lanka, they have always been the Jews, but these movements have now moved into Nazi territory with regard to the Muslims. And we have seen some very, very serious violence against the Muslims that was organized at a communal plus level with at least tacit assistance from the state, but simply by inaction to prevent it, because these have gone on for days. The last occurrence that happened in February in 2018 had over 200 establishments vandalized or destroyed, including houses in Kandy. And much of the rhetoric around the incitements to violence in that period have been around positioning the Islam and Muslim people as a threat. So, of course, in the current climate or the aftermath of what has happened, those claims suddenly look like they have been vindicated, which is very unfortunate, because those claims actually were fueling something extremely destructive and negative in Sri Lankan society. But the purveyors of those claims now stand to gain by the actions that have taken place. There's no intelligent Muslim organization or supporters of Muslims who could have wanted that to happen, and we must think of them as really acting unintelligently in this particular situation in terms of Muslim interests, whatever took place. So I think that is, and right now, what you see is that, of course, the attack did not target Buddhist places. So that does present, if you like, a puzzle of sorts. Because if the axis of communal tension in Sri Lanka for the Muslims was Buddhists, and these very groups that we have spoken about and come up in the news as being responsible, have been previously identified as responsible in trying to remove or vandalize Buddhist statues in Mavanala area. So they also seem to have potentially a history or connection to expressing some level of antagonism against the hegemony of the Buddhist establishment. And yet the targets chosen are explicitly not Buddhists, they are Christian. And the thing is that Muslims and Christians in Sri Lanka share a common sense of being a little besieged. While the Muslims, it is new and more acute in the last few years, for the Christians, this is a chronic, occasionally acute, long-standing problem that goes back a good 30 years, since the 1980s. And I called up the National Christian Evangelical Alliance yesterday and asked them, because they keep a track of violence, how many incidents they had recorded of religious violence against Christian institutions since 2015, after the change in government, when things were thought to have become a great deal better. The number they gave me was 400 in 3 years and 3 months. So that is a very significant number of attacks of some nature that, of course, it was studied to classify, how serious each one was, but the recorded number of religious violence cases fitting, well thought out definition turns out to be 400. So I think that in many ways, this kind of action did also bring sympathy to the Christians from the Buddhists. There was a remarkably positive speaking up that took place from Buddhist leaders, from political leaders, from leaders of Muslim leaders, and even Christian leaders. I think that they expressed a great deal of solidarity. People were asked to, empathize with the grief, with the suffering. And what you saw in the aftermath, if anything, I think reduced the tension between the Christians and the Buddhists, because there was a sense of, recognizing the victimhood of the Christians in this scenario. And that was a very positive thing that we saw on television, and I think was intentionally done and led by leaders of all communities and religions. However, what you also see currently is this idea that Sinhalese people could potentially now have revenge attacks on ordinary Muslim people because the attackers, as you know, were identified as Muslims. This to me is quite strange. So I got an email today from a Chilean friend of mine who's living outside the country. And she gave me a detailed story of a Pakistani refugee in Sri Lanka who found his house surrounded, and he was attacked. And the security forces watched and protected his life, but didn't stop him from being beaten up thoroughly. And then he had to leave his house after that. And she said, Nishan, when there are attacks by Muslim people in the UK, in France, we never hear of such stories. Now, why is it that in your country these things can happen? Are you all less educated? Or is there some political, manipulation of people's emotions that is making this happen? I think that's a very serious question. Because we, as South Asians, I think, not just as Sri Lankans, this is true perhaps even for Indians and others in South Asia, we take a sort of a brutishness of the mob, of a social mob for granted, which we don't actually do in Western societies. It is not taken for granted that people should get up and enact violence against their neighbors and others in the way that has been almost assumed as a risk in South Asia and in Sri Lanka. And I find that quite disappointing. I want to believe in a society and in a country in which ordinary people, the brutish imperative isn't a fixed assumption about how ordinary people would respond to calamities of this nature. So I think the general community tension in terms of whether Muslim people are feeling safe is, I think, has significantly moved in a negative direction. There are people at my own organization, Verité Research, that are today left their houses because they live near mosques and they don't want to be, they're too scared to live there. And they feel that there's a danger of being attacked. And are taking refuge in other places. That is, to me, an extremely disappointing. Tells me an extremely disappointing, simple truth with a simple T about our society as well. That needs to be, I think, addressed.
In fact, tomorrow is the first Friday since the attack.
And Muslims have been told not to go to mosque.
Yeah. So in fact, the police chief here has also issued a warning that there is a possibility.
It's the brutishness imperative.
Yeah.
Police are not threatening to attack the mosques.
Exactly.
But people are, and how is a human being who goes and attacks a mosque any better than that bomber?
Yeah, right.
Right? For me, that is really surprising that we take this for granted. But I think it is made possible by our own tacit acceptance of that possibility. It is when you believe that a drunkard is, prone to beat up his wife, that the drunk man, in a society that believes that that's possible, the drunkards beat up their wives. Much more. So it's not drinking itself, it is the social consent and tacitly that comes from saying that is understandable within quotes that makes that possible. It is that understanding that we give it in our societies, I think, that also makes it a reality. We need to be more surprised, and then it would be less possible.
And why do you think, of all the places, all the countries in the world or in Asia, why Sri Lanka? I mean, I'm here, of course, presuming that there was an international terror organization that is behind it, in some sense, if not directly inspired. It was an attack. It was a spate of attacks inspired by.
So I think when trying to understand the events and what happened, and when I say that it was not foreseeable and we didn't foresee it, one of the things that really is difficult to understand is why Sri Lanka. So I would put it another way. I would say there are two layers of difficulty in terms of understanding the events. One is why Sri Lanka and why the Catholic Church or the church, Christian church. I think the reason these questions become very difficult to make sense of or have to have good answers is because of the assumption we make that this is an ISIS. I don't know how people say IS, Daesh, whatever, but that there is an international terror network at play that logically does not have Sri Lanka on its sides, and there is that rationality is hard to connect, and within Sri Lanka certainly does not have the Christians in their sights. And I think the question of why Sri Lanka becomes lacks a good explanation, honestly, on the narrative and explanations that we have for who is behind these attacks. I think there's no doubt that the people conducting the attacks are part of a radicalized Muslim group within Sri Lanka. I don't think that we lack evidence for that conclusion. But I think the more difficult question is really not just about the people who conducted the attack, but the selection of targets and what is driving that, and why Sri Lanka. So honestly, I cannot make sense of why ISIS would direct Sri Lanka as a target, and why, if so, they would direct within Sri Lanka the Christians as a target. Even if you make sense of the hotels, I don't think we can make sense of the church attacks. So I think looking at the aftermath of what has taken place, we have to now ask what are the consequences. We have talked about the consequences in terms of communal relationships, but I think it's also important to talk about the consequences in terms of the state and citizen relationship. The consequence on the state and citizen relationship, I think, can be evaluated in two ways. One is how does this impact the state's, immediate ability to control the citizen? But secondly, how does it also shape then the kind of state that the citizen is asking for or concerned about? The most significant and the most negative shift that I see that's emerging as a consequence is that the discourse that we had and was growing ever since especially 2014 about the importance of improving governance, of reducing corruption, of expanding the scope of our democracy. These conversations have suddenly paled and almost visibly into a lower order priority set of questions. And what we have done is resurfaced and brought to the fore. So if you've said, in a sense, it's a switching of the background and the foreground. We have brought back to the foreground the questions of national security and safety, which were in the foreground during the years of war, all the way up to 2010, even 11, in the immediate aftermath of the war. And what happened as the country experienced more and more peace was that the national security and safety questions began to lose their salience, and the governance, democracy, and corruption questions emerged into the foreground and in great style in January 2015. But they were in competition then with the national security and safety questions. So if you analyze the singular media in 2014, there was this very significant debate about whether we had to think about security and safety first, or we had to think about corruption and governance first. And as 2014 progressed, the balance shifted to corruption and governance as being the more important concern. And the government then always also manufactured, leaks of information about a new terrorist threat, the re-emergence of the LTTE, bombs found in different places. I'm not saying they were false, but certainly the engineering them into the people's information set and the discourse was part of trying to maintain the politics of security, safety as being still the most important, dominant concern for society. But that battle was lost, and corruption especially emerged as the dominant concern for society. But I think this event in one fell sweep has switched the foreground and background once again. And today, you hear people saying, and I was at a meeting in the morning, who cares about democracy, and forget about corruption, we want security. And we want back those who can give us security. And I think when people don't voice it like that, that sense, there's an overwhelming way in which that sense has taken over, because these attacks were of a nature to completely change the sense of political salience of these two sets of questions for people. So I think while it does strengthen the state and its ability to control, I'm not necessarily seeing that as the immediate risk, because the political configuration that you have today is, of course, very concerned to control, to use means of control. So we've had movements to bring counterterrorism legislation that's very draconian, and it has been resisted by civil society. We've had movements to bring regulation of media that we felt were very draconian and unnecessary, that have been resisted also by think tanks and others like us. Because we feel that, especially in South Asia and in Sri Lanka, that we must be careful not to give the state a toolkit for suppression. And often the old toolkit was more flagrantly unlawful. It used extrajudicial violence and means that were connected to just political thuggery. But the new, the emerging toolkit, I think in societies like ours, uses the law itself, selectively applied, a law that gives too much discretion as a toolkit for suppressing political dissent, and we have been very concerned for keeping that at bay. So I think there is a risk of losing ground on the ability to resist some of that legislation and some of those regulations. But that risk goes beyond the immediate risk. There's a greater risk in changing the political configuration to elect people who do not believe at all on the restraints of governance that brought this government into power. And certainly those who feel that national security and lack of restraint for those in power should be the way in which we should have leadership, had their hands strengthened today by the events that happened. So I think currently, in trying to understand who could be behind it, there have been, we've heard several theories at play. People have talked about, this. I think all these theories have at the root of it Islamic militant groups, and of course then they try to ascribe motive. Okay, so I think the fact that there was a Sri Lankan Muslim individuals and that they would have been part of a movement of Muslim people that were being in some way radicalized, if I can use that term and it means something. I think there is clear evidence for that, and I said that before, that we know that the individuals involved were Muslim, that they were connected to an organization that worked on some sense of radicalized thinking and understanding. I think on the positive side, what you have seen is that the Sri Lankan capacity to pull back from the brink. So I think one of the fascinating things about Sri Lanka is that our society is capable, has almost a talent to getting to the edge of the precipice and then stepping back, and then going there again and doing so repeatedly. And so in a time of acute crisis, we tend to figure out how to do things right a little better. And I think I'm very heartened by the way in which, leaders of all communities and enormously Buddhist priests. So you don't hear Nanasara in this time. He's not getting coverage. What is getting coverage is Buddhist monks who are very clear that this was wrong, the church was wrong, and sitting alongside Muslim leaders who are saying, we are not a part of this, we didn't say this should happen, we have warned about it, this doesn't represent us. And people saying, that a group of Muslims who committed violence does not represent an ethnic community, and that would be absurd. So I think it would be too early to think that Buddhist fundamentalism is going to be heightened, because to some extent I think there is a sensibility in society that also sees what I'm saying, that there is a vicious cycle and that we must not keep treading down, we must not keep turning around in that circle. And there is a certain social implicit sanity, I think, that kicks in to recognize that the country has to pull back, and the event was momentous enough. So it would be too early to call how this is going to play out. Right? It could play out negatively for the Buddhist extreme rhetoric, because when it reemerges, it can well be identified as this is precisely the kind of thing we don't want, because now we can see down that road and see where it takes us. And it's almost like we were walking down a path and a train from the future came, and crashed into you, reminding you what's at the end of that path. And then you have to stop and take stock. And I hope that is what has happened, that we can now take stock and say that was the wrong path and we need to find another one. That's my hope. I think we have to work in that direction.
Once again, we've been listening to a fascinating interview between Nishan De Mel, the executive director of Verité Research, and our own TMP board member Vishal Arora, going deeper on the analysis of the recent Easter attacks in Sri Lanka. For the full audio clip and transcript of this interview, you can find it on our website at religionunplugged.com.